Hello, everyone. Welcome to Worldwide Doyle. This is our third event
Event.
for 2025. I hope everyone's okay. It's lovely to see everyone again. Hello. Hi, everyone. Please do put in the chat where you're all from. You know, I like to know where everyone is. I can see a nice, good spread out there, which is good. I know I'm going to get Petersfield come up soon and New York. Ah, Toronto. Hello, hello. I hope everyone's well. It's a very hot, humid day in Portsmouth in the UK. I hope it's beautiful weather wherever you are. Mind you, it's hot and I'm still wearing a jumper. So there you go. We've got a lovely evening today. I'm just going to go through. Please, could you turn your cameras and your microphones off? That would be really helpful. Hello, Douglas. Ah, hot in Toronto. Think I'd like to swap the heat from Portsmouth for the heat in Toronto. I hope everyone is all good and everyone's in. I feel like I'm doing like a story time or something sometimes when I do this. So we have our third edition of Worldwide Doyle. Um, these lecture series have now been rebranded, as they rightly should be, to honour Professor Neil McCaw, who worked extremely hard at the initial stages of the collection throughout to develop and to deliver many items and many sort of exhibitions and books and things relating to the Conan Doyle collection over his time. He sadly passed away in 2020. So these talks are in honour of his work with the Richard Larkson Green Conan Doyle collection. Tonight we have Jonathan Cranfield. I'm really looking forward to Conan Doyle, marriage and divorce. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to John.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. So the subject of my talk is Conan Doyle's relationship with marriage and divorce. So a few years ago, I wrote a book which I mulled over the title, and eventually I decided on 20th century Victorian, in which I suppose the overarching narrative was about seeing Conan Doyle's life and work in the 20th century as a kind of analepsis, walking into the future with a set of values and attitudes fixed in and on the past. And while I did make some concessions to the ways in which Conan Doyle responded to the changing times, one of the things that I've learned over the last few years is that I did not give him enough credit. And so this is in way of making a sort of penance to the perhaps slightly reductive picture that I might have painted of him then. Um, and so the issue of divorce and Conan Doyle's role in the movement for divorce reform in the early 20th century is something that's been noted, I think, in all of the major biographies of Conan Doyle. But I thought it would be useful to go into that into more detail, to start examining Conan Doyle's views and try and work out a pattern of how it figured in his life from his childhood and through his own marriages, and trying to find the ways in which that married up with changing attitudes about marriage and divorce in wider British culture, the changing social patterns of early 20th century England. So we'll pick up the story in the 1850s with two troubled births. One was a piece of legislation, the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, and the other was Conan Doyle himself, born into one of the difficult marriages that would come to preoccupy Conan Doyle some decades later, the marriage of his own parents. So first, the Matrimonial Causes Act. This was one of the great symbols of Victorian legal reform, and took responsibility away from canon law, from the courts administered and run by the Church of England, and bringing it to the public. And it also alleviated the need to obtain acts of parliament in order to obtain a divorce. Um, this is famously the previous state of affairs, where you needed to obtain those things, where you needed to get a vote in the House of Commons and a vote in the House of Lords, was memorably satirized in Dickens's Hard Times, when Stephen Blackpool confronts his employer, Josiah Bounderby, and Bounderby tells him that if he wants to get a divorce, you'll have to go to Doctors' Commons with a suit, you'd have to go to a court of common law with a suit, and you'd have to go to the House of Lords with a suit, and you'd have to get an act of parliament to enable you to marry again. And it would cost you, if it was a case of very plain sailing, I suppose, from £1,000 to £1,500. So the Matrimonial Causes Act was a way of remedying this disparity, but the legislation was deeply conservative and unequal in its view of marriage, divorce, and its sense of the relationship, the desired relationship between men and women. Men could divorce women for infidelity alone, whereas women would need to prove aggravating factors alongside infidelity, including physical abuse, sodomy, bestiality. Although the Act made divorce more financially feasible for the upper middle and professional classes, it was still very expensive, meaning that the poor and lower middle classes still had no viable route towards divorce. The result was a two-tier system where those with money could obtain a divorce if they were prepared to undergo the resulting publicity, whereas the poor increasingly could only expect what was referred to as a separation order, which relieved the spouses of some of their obligations, such as cohabitation, but which prevented them from remarrying. And this created an ever-growing section of the population that were left in limbo, unable to remarry and subject to severe social judgment over any romantic or sexual relationships. Another unintended consequence of the Matrimonial Causes Act was that it made divorce a public spectacle, at precisely the point that the British press was undergoing a huge expansion thanks to the repeal of the taxes on knowledge. This is duties and levies paid on paper, taxes paid to the government based on the number of times you published in the year, and so on. And these were slowly relaxed and wound back through the 1850s, which led to a huge growth in the number of periodicals being published. And so the Divorce Court in London, in Westminster Hall, effectively the only place where you could obtain a divorce in the country, allowed journalists and members of the public in to watch. And so it provided a fountainhead of gossip that could fill the pages of these newspapers and magazines. And this reveals some of the uncomfortable truths, some of the hypocrisy underlying Victorian attitudes towards sex and sexuality. Here's an example, an apt one taken from the Idler in 1893, where you have a kind of scenario told through comic photographs. And here you can see people reading about the great divorce case in a newspaper. Have you heard this? I've heard about it. Then why did she take her aunt with her? Why, don't you see? That's good, isn't it? You can see the look of scopophilic appreciation on their faces there. And then finally, the retreat into judgment and prudishness. The papers ought not to be allowed to publish such things. So the promise of salacious gossip was hard to resist. And this coverage of divorce cases provided ways to circumnavigate the strict policing of fiction publishing. So through various methods, there were quite tight restraints on what you could get away with putting in short stories and novels and serializations. But by doing court reportage, you would be able to include all sorts of things, details of secret visitations, of unsealed private letters, the testimonies of servants, and physical evidence allowed the reading public to gaze through the keyhole into the sexual lives of others and to discover uncomfortable truths, I guess, about the gulf between dominant Victorian morality and real life as it was lived by individuals. So the Act, the Matrimonial Causes Act, was what we might call then a pregnant widow, storing up matter for future debates on the subject right through the 19th and into the 20th century. I want to reflect at this point, I guess, about why divorce was so restricted, why even when legislation was passed, it still severely limited its accessibility. Each marriage, so ran the dominant view, was a metonym for society and the country as a whole. Vows made before church or state were not viewed simply as interpersonal commitments or as a legal contract between parties. They represented a compact with society as a whole, an oath taken usually before God, the idea that that could be broken by temporal legal instruments was often thought to be the first small rip that could tear apart the very foundations of society itself. The unequal infidelity clauses were an instrument designed first to limit the number of children born outside of marriage and to ensure the smooth passage of property to quote unquote legitimate offspring. So against this backdrop, we can turn our attention to the second troubled birth, which is Conan Doyle himself, drawn there memorably, possibly by his father, Charles Altamont Doyle. So Conan Doyle was born in 1859, product of a marriage between Charles Altamont Doyle and Mary Doyle, née Foley. We know that Conan Doyle's childhood and the life of the family as a whole was blighted by Charles's poor physical and mental health, as well as by his severe alcoholism. We also know that Charles, Conan Doyle's father, was repeatedly institutionalized throughout the second half of his life until his death in 1893, and that while he did appear to deeply love Conan Doyle's mother, he was incapable of providing the kind of stability and support demanded by Victorian marriage conventions. This is one of Charles's sketches. Where are we now? Give me. There we go. That's one of Charles's sketches, which demonstrates a deeply felt and presumably genuine love for his wife. Mary, my ideal home ruler. No repeal of the union proposed in this case. So that's one of his cartoons there, which makes a connection between the idea of divorce and also the separation of Ireland from Great Britain. Charles, Conan Doyle's father, was an ardent home ruler, believer in Irish independence, in contrast to the ideas and values of his son, right up until the 1920s. But many commentators at the time identified a connection between political unions and marital unions. One of the men with whom Conan Doyle will come into conflict in the 1910s and 20s on this subject, Arthur Hugh Cecil, would use the marital infidelities of Charles Stewart Parnell, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, as a way of undermining the case for Irish Home Rule. Incontinence in marriage was supposed, in his view, to lead to incontinence in other matters, rather more weighty. Andrew Lycett, in his biography of Conan Doyle, paints a rather vivid picture of life of the young Conan Doyle living with his father. He, Charles, would drag himself around the floor behaving like a nincompoop, unable to remember his own name. For the best part of a year, he was unable to attend work and was put on half pay. In order to finance his regular binges, he would steal from his wife and children, breaking open the latter's money boxes, and he would run up large bills with shopkeepers for goods he later sold. One Edinburgh pub was full of drawings that Charles had given or sold cheaply for alcohol. When nothing else was available, he drank furniture varnish. And so these experiences, as one might imagine, left Conan Doyle with a very clear sense of how lives could be blighted by incompatible marriages. And this particularly affected, in his view, women tied to husbands who were incapable of providing for them. Conan Doyle's biographers can get a little bit squeamish about the relationship between Mary Doyle and her lodger, Brian Charles Waller, who was one of the very few witnesses to Conan Doyle's first marriage. But it does seem, on the balance of probability, highly likely that Conan Doyle's mother and her lodger had a romantic relationship for many years during Charles's enforced absences. And this seems to have created some profound dissonance in Conan Doyle's life and work, since he felt pressured to treat the subject, both of his father's illness, his addiction, and his mother's possible infidelity, in fiction like The Cardboard Box, The Abbey Grange, Surgeon of Gasterfell, some of these stories which he then suppressed until very late in his mother's life, and indeed in some cases until after her death. So Conan Doyle felt a compulsion to deal with these subjects, but often ended up regretting having done so. So this creates an interesting dynamic in Conan Doyle's world as we get into the period of time where he enters his first marriage in 1885 as a relatively young GP in Southsea. And he carried with him his sense of legal wrong being done by the lack of availability of divorce, along with all his natural skepticism about religious dogma and a willingness to entertain some fairly radical ideas about how society might be changed going forward. So there you have Conan Doyle's first marriage certificate, and then his second marriage in 1907, which occurred a year or so after the death of his first wife. And this leads us, I guess, to speculate a little bit about Conan Doyle's marital dilemmas. The evidence from his life and behaviour seems pretty clear on this score. He married Louisa Hawkins quickly, in haste, and perhaps under some of the external stresses of caring for her dying brother in his practice, events detailed in later fiction, including the Stark Munro letters. Louisa, or Louise, appears to have been quiet, unassuming, undemanding, and in the words of Andrew Lycett, a domestic and professional prop, never likely to dislodge the supremacy of Conan Doyle's mother. In 1893, she was diagnosed with severe tuberculosis, and their marriage entered a new period of separation, medically imposed celibacy, and Louise's retreat from an active role in the household and in Conan Doyle's life. Under these conditions, he met the woman who would become his second wife, Jean Leckie. He meets her in 1897, 4 years after his wife's diagnosis, and began a romantic, though apparently not sexual relationship with her on the understanding that his wife could not live more than a few years longer. So there's no evidence of a sexual relationship between the two of them. And if this was the case, then Conan Doyle could congratulate himself, I suppose, on not yielding to the same temptations as his mother did under comparable yet still rather different circumstances. He did have another course open to him, however, and it's worth thinking about why he didn't choose to pursue this other course. He could have begun a relationship in the open with Jean. He could have allowed it to become public knowledge, allowed the case to come to court, become divorced, and then remarry, taking on the reputational damage, as indeed someone like John Galsworthy did in 1905, when his married partner, was divorced from her husband, enabling them to marry in the immediate aftermath of it. And indeed, the subject of divorce is treated by the generation of writers in the early 20th century who take up the question of divorce in their fiction, like John Galsworthy, and also Arnold Bennett, who published Whom God Hath Joined, which features 2 cases sensationally arriving in divorce courts towards the end of it in 1906. So Conan Doyle chose not to pursue that course, and of course, in many ways, if you know anything about Conan Doyle, that seems very right and natural. He chose, of course, to maintain Jean and conduct parallel romantic relationships, one inside the family home and one outside of it. This was not conducted without censure from some in his inner circle, but essentially he established a wife in waiting and began waiting for Louisa to die. So in ethical terms, it's quite easy to understand this mindset in order to spare his wife the potential upset and disruption of the divorce. But I think that Conan Doyle was possibly also conscious of the radical origins of the divorce movement. He wanted to clearly distinguish his line of conduct from that of his mother, but also from the radical thinkers who had first criticized the establishment of marriage in the late 18th and the early 19th century. His own, I think a useful example here comes from Percy Shelley, who writes in his notes to Queen Mab that law pretends even to govern the indisciplinable wanderings of passion. Love withers under constraint. Its very essence is liberty. It is compatible neither with obedience, jealousy, nor fear. How long, then, ought the sexual connection to last? What law ought to specify the extent of the grievances which should limit its duration? A husband and wife ought to continue so long as they love each other. Any law which should bind them to cohabitation for one moment after the decay of their affection would be a most intolerable tyranny and the most unworthy of toleration. And so that's Percy Shelley's very radical views proposed in 1813. And in making that argument, he was drawing on and elaborating from writers like William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, in some ways becoming even more radical than they were. So Conan Doyle, I think, was very wary of this kind of rhetoric. This kind of rhetoric would get you accused of being having lax morals yourself. And I suppose this reputation for the person seeking a divorce to satisfy their own desires goes all the way back to the impression of Henry VIII, the LeBron James of getting divorced because you've met someone that you prefer. So Conan Doyle was very wary of this perspective, and instead found perhaps unlikely sympathizers in the early feminist movement of the later and the second half of the 19th century, writers like Frances Power Cobbe, who again was very critical of marriage, but never sought to undermine its foundations. She still saw an ideal society as being composed of happy marriages, but just ones that were organized along more equal lines, and where there was less economic pressure on women to make unsuitable matches. So Frances Power Cobbe, who wrote a series of articles, including her most famous article, which is called Wife Torture in England, about domestic abuse, about which she writes in very harrowing terms. But she was also writing for a female audience, asking them to consider very seriously about making the decision to jump into marriage. The divorce court, she writes, so this is 1862. She's had 5 years of evidence of the divorce court running. The divorce court, in righting the most appalling wrongs to which the members of a civilized community could be subjected, has revealed secrets which must tend to modify immensely our ideas of English domestic felicity. It has always been vaguely known, indeed, that both husbands and wives sometimes broke their most solemn vows and fell into sin. But it was reserved for the new law to show how many hundreds of such tragedies underlie the outwardly decorous lives, not only of the long-blamed aristocracy, but of the middle ranks in England. So I think Conan Doyle, in many ways, his view of marriage was shaped by aligning himself on this side of the argument and against people like Percy Shelley and the communitarian and socialist thinkers who came after him, who sought to build parallel institutions to create a very different society altogether. And so I think it's useful in this now to pick up the story of Conan Doyle's involvement with the Divorce Law Reform Union, the DLRU, which was formed in 1906 by the merger of two political pressure groups that have the same aims regarding divorce law reform. And like other groups, they functioned by soliciting donations and subscriptions to run what was referred to unembarrassedly at the time as a propaganda campaign. And what they wanted, their main goal, was the appointment of a royal commission on the question of divorce reform, find ways that it could be more equitable and more accessible. But in practice, the DLRU did lots of other stuff as well. So they ran an office in Copthall Avenue in the City of London, and they subsidised a troupe of public speakers that would travel around the country to address clubs and societies and unions. They would distribute pamphlets, the cost of which would be subsidised by the union itself. And they tried to attract public figures to their cause and direct public opinion through press interviews and opinion pieces. So some of the earliest appearances of the union in the public press involve bringing towards the public the cases of certain women who have been trapped with abusive or alcoholic or insane husbands and who have been unable to obtain a divorce from them, and the social stigma that attaches to them and the way in which it blights their lives. So there was a big move towards getting women to write about their experiences, send them into the union. The union would then anonymously publicize them as a way of directing public sentiment and changing its deeply entrenched, in many cases, opposition towards divorce reform. But I think it's telling that the union adopts quite a conservative framing of marriage in itself. So a key feature of their rhetoric lay in highlighting the large body of men and women who were officially or unofficially separated and who were thus unable to remarry. And the suggestion was that being left in this limbo was essentially being pushed towards immorality. And this body of people, if they were able to remarry, if they were given that freedom, then society would begin to stitch itself back together again. The DLRU also sought to be a direct political lobby to the Home Secretary's office, and so they maintained communications with them and had semi-regular meetings, though not as many as they would have wished. So this is where Conan Doyle's path intersects with the DLRU just after 1906, and it seems significant in some ways that Conan Doyle felt able to take up this question only in 1907, after the death of his first wife, after his remarriage. Suddenly it seemed like a question that he wanted to be involved in. And so this is the first public press mention that I can find about Conan Doyle aligning his cause and allowing his name to be trumpeted alongside the Divorce Law Reform Union. And here he is, expressed hearty sympathy with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle alongside his peers, George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, and the writer, unclassifiable writer, George R. Sims, who wrote musical comedies and travel pieces around London, alongside much popular fiction as well. And so that occurs in August 1907. And then in 1909, Conan Doyle assumes the presidency of the Divorce Law Reform Union. And in this capacity, he conducts a number of quite high-profile debates, arguments, contests with other notable figures who are opposed to divorce law reform. I've mentioned one of those men already, Arthur Hugh Cecil, who becomes a particular bête noire of Conan Doyle's involvement in this cause. But another of his contestants, of his combatants, was the very popular novelist Hall Caine, who was opposed to divorce reform and suggested that it would lead to a certain laxness in attitudes towards marriage, that people would marry and divorce more freely, and again, that the fabric of society would fall apart. That kind of rhetoric is reused over and over again on that side of the debate. But it's useful, I think, to look at one of Conan Doyle's responses to Hall Caine here. And here you can really see the rhetoric that Conan Doyle used to justify his commitment to divorce reform. It is not the purpose, he writes, of the Divorce Law Reform Union to weaken the institution of marriage in any way. On the contrary, their whole exertions are directed towards strengthening it by a removal of those anomalies of law and hardships in practice which are abhorrent to common sense and incapable of reasoned defence. There is no desire to introduce legislation which encourages frivolous divorce, only the alleviation of human misery. And as a way of making this point, Conan Doyle sets his views up in opposition to those of many American states like California or Nevada, who had a much lower bar to access divorce. And this indeed becomes a feature of transatlantic discussion, the ease with which Americans may obtain a divorce in contrast to their British cousins. There's one other aspect of this response to Hall Caine that I want to pick out, because I think it connects his attitudes very explicitly to those of his earlier life. You must forgive me the very poor quality of this of this JPEG. My goodness, truly grotesque. But in this anecdote, Conan Doyle recounts an anecdote from the early days of his medical practice. I had experience of a case where a young innocent girl, upon her wedding night, found the bridegroom senseless in their bedroom. Horribly alarmed, she sent for medical help. The man was dead drunk, however, and before the honeymoon was over, she had realized that she was tied for life to a man who was permanently and hopelessly possessed by this filthiest of all the devils. And in this description, I think we can see a very clear infusion of Conan Doyle's views about his own father and his anxieties that he felt about it, the duty of care that he felt alongside his deep distress at his association with him. Later on, he says, where is the justice in chaining the two together? Are the interests of the tortured children to go for nothing? Or is it not better, when the facts are absolutely established, that the dipsomaniac alcoholic be placed where he or she can do least harm, and that they either be penalized no longer? This is the view of the Divorce Law Reform Union. And so he populates his rhetoric with figures which we might recognize from his own life. The tortured child may well be seen as Conan Doyle himself, and the wife who finds herself tied for life to such a husband can be seen as Mary Doyle, Conan Doyle's mother herself. And we might wonder how it appears to Conan Doyle. Would she have been spared? What would she have been spared if she had been able to obtain a divorce much earlier on in their marriage? What further immoralities or transgressions would he have not had to contemplate in his life? So you can see here, I think, a pretty clear case of Conan Doyle, a clear instance rather of Conan Doyle's rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric that he used. So he was keen to bring about divorce reform, but he was also very keen to ward off any accusations of laxness in his own personal morality. And it's to Conan Doyle's credit, I suppose, that he continues making this argument right through the First World War. And you can see various articles in 1917 where the Divorce Law Reform Union was advocating for a bill that came before a private member's bill that came before Parliament to bring about some of these changes. And Conan Doyle was accused essentially of treachery. While men and boys are away fighting in France, this rhetoric went. Conan Doyle is undermining the foundations of the homes that they seek to come back to. And I think this is a real credit to Conan Doyle that he persisted with his advocacy for the cause, even in the face of these quite damaging personal attacks. The Royal Commission that the Divorce Law Reform Union sought met between 1909 and 1910 and made a series of recommendations that came before Parliament and wafted around Parliament, but which were not taken up in earnest until 1923, when they became law, when the infidelity clauses were equalised for men and women, and indeed when a number of other hangovers, vestigial remnants of canon law were removed from common law. And so by this point, however, Conan Doyle has stepped away from that organisation. He is no longer the president of the DLRU. I'm not sure exactly when he resigned the presidency, but it appears to be about 1920 or early 1921. And at this point, he seems to disengage from many of his activities that had previously occupied his time. And I think here you can see a pattern that's bound up with his increasing preoccupation with spiritualism. This consumes his time, his attention, his money, and the many organizations and clubs and societies and causes that he was previously associated with, he becomes a much less visible proponent of them. In the Society of Authors, for example, Conan Doyle was classed as no longer being an active member after about 1920. So he no longer was involved in those causes, and his name virtually disappears from debate around marriage and divorce after 1921. So where does this leave us? This essay that we've made into Conan Doyle's dabble in activism. And to what extent was it fair to call Conan Doyle a 20th century Victorian, as I did some years ago? Because he showed himself quite ready to challenge some of the core tenets of Victorian belief. He was critical of organised religion throughout his life, but there was also a window from the early 1900s until the 1920s where he showed himself capable of radically questioning and revising his other views, such as on home rule for Ireland, on questions of free trade in the post-war age of Americanization, and indeed on our subject for tonight, divorce. Those critiques, however, were always bound by a desperate need to maintain an authentic claim to higher morality. Divorce reform was only good inasmuch as it increased the salience and proliferation of marriage itself. In this regard, his attitude seems to have been so firmly shaped by his early experiences that he was unable to escape from the gravitational pull of Victorian habits and modes of thought, despite being diverted from them by his own commitment to progress and his critique of religious authorities. Okay, thanks very much for your time. I'm looking forward to, if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to go into it.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. It looks like we have a hand up already. Would you like to come off camera and ask? Just trying to navigate, find the hand. Anyone? Where did I see that? You know, when you're just like mid trying to come back into the world again and it all sort of goes. How do you think, I'll ask a question while we're waiting, shall we? How do you think Doyle viewed women as a whole? Sorry. That's a big
No,
one.
no, thank you. No, it's an important question. Well, there's a story, isn't there, about how when he was on a train with his sons, and his a woman left the carriage, and his son remarked that the woman was ugly, and Conan Doyle struck him and said that no woman is ugly. Um, and you can see there a kind of a little snapshot, I guess, of his attitudes. I suppose he was very keen on adopting a traditionally chivalric attitude towards women, which was, I suppose, yeah, I suppose he felt that quite deeply. But then I think a modern reader might look at those attitudes and say that in themselves they contain quite a deal of condescension. And he was, as we know, a relatively strident opponent of female suffrage, right up until the point when it actually happened in 1919, when he begrudgingly prepared to accept it. So I think there's actually a good deal of inconsistency in Conan Doyle's views about women as a class. Um, uh, so yeah, I think that's where we find him on
Yeah,
the.
that's interesting, actually, isn't it? Because you could look at his relationship with Louisa, and did he marry her because he felt sorry for her because Jack was so ill and had left the family? It's all sorts of interesting things. And his second wife, he seemed to be held, he seemed to absolutely adore her, um, quite quite more than before, or anything that we'd seen before. So there was also that relationship as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, so I think with his first wife, I mean, there's also a question of money in the sense that she was able to bring him in some money, not a huge amount, but from mortgages and estates that she was able to were settled on her that she was able to bring into the marriage. There was obviously the drama of her brother's death, but he does seem to have pursued her quite fervently in the immediate aftermath of that. And so, my suspicion, I mean, if everyone's comfortable for me drifting into the realm of pure speculation, it seems to me that she embodied the ideal of the quiet helpmeet for Conan Doyle. And that after marrying her, he quickly got tired of that. And you can see in the figure of Jean Leckie, who was much more cosmopolitan, artistic, um, exciting, I guess. Then, so that meeting her when the marriage was in the doldrums during her illness, um, then I think it's human nature that she made an impression on him and led to the way he viewed her very differently.
Hmm. Interesting, isn't it? Food for thought. We have a question. What evidence do you have for Mary Doyle to have had an affair with Waller and for
Okay,
Arthur Conan Doyle not to have had one with Jean? Ooh.
okay, let's go. Um, it's a really good question, and the truth is that we don't know. What we do know is that Waller moved into the family home, that he assumed many of the duties that would usually be fulfilled by the head of the house in Charles's frequent absences. We know that Waller gave Conan Doyle guidance on pursuing a medical career, that he visited him in Portsmouth in Southsea regularly, that he might have been best man at his wedding, but that they also had fallings out. And also that there are these curious gaps where he's almost never alluded to in Conan Doyle's surviving letters. And I suppose the smoking gun for an affair would be in Memories and Adventures, his 1924 autobiography, where he says that his mother's, how does he put it? The pressure on my mother to take in lodgers was helpful in some ways, but disastrous in others. And then I suppose there's the other piece of evidence which you might want to include, which is the story of the cardboard box, the Sherlock Holmes story, which features a woman named Mary who marries an alcoholic and then begins an affair with a younger man, who then is murdered by her husband. And Conan Doyle published that story in the Strand, but then suppressed it from the book edition of The Return of Sherlock Holmes at the end of 1893, only reviving it some years later when his mother was on her last legs. So for ACD not to have a sexual relationship with Jean, oh, we don't. That's just, I mean, it's just the realm of pure speculation. So it's absence of evidence in that case. No one said that they did, so we have to take him at his word, however skeptical we might be.
Brilliant. Douglas, do you want to? Yeah, I think your hand was up first.
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan. That was a lot of fun as usual. And most of it was news to me. So I'm very grateful for the information content of what you said. And incidentally, I'm inclined to agree with you about the relationship with Gene. Several of his, it split the family very much, didn't it? Several of his
Yeah,
family members were highly disapproving of that relationship, even though it was conducted very decorously in public.
yeah,
That seems to suggest that they had their suspicions about it. There are two things I wanted to, they're not really a question, but to ask you to say a bit more about. First of all, it struck me that the Matrimonial Causes Act, again, I knew nothing about this, but it's great that it happened in the same year as his birth. You couldn't have made it up. Um, that seems to have been one of the last battles in the war between canon law and common law. And it was one of the last moments in which the power of the church over law was wrested away from them. Um, and I just wondered whether, in the matter of divorce, um, Conan Doyle's anti-clericalism came into this at all, that he was a lifelong anti-church man, um, very consistently and rather honorably, I think. And so I wonder if that was might be seen as a factor for him, that um, the grip of the church on society and the way people behaved seemed to him to be just not modern, you
yeah,
know, kind
yeah,
of medieval. So that was one thing I'd let you to say a little bit more about. The second thing is even vaguer, and that's the idea of the 20th century Victorian, which I think is actually very productive. One of the ways in which, so Conan Doyle is, in this respect, when it comes to the divorce question, lining himself up with liberal and progressive views in society. On the other hand, as you very carefully explained, he, he's doing so in a very conservative way, which is rather typical. Um, and it just occurred to me that the context for this is his own notion of his own reputation and his reputation as a writer. And this, I think, is very Victorian and not modern. His reputation as a writer, he saw being attached to his standing as an upright citizen, and in particular as a model to young people, not just in his stories, but of course it is in his stories, but also in his life. So that this is something I feel he was always aware of being, in a sense, on show as what we would now call a celebrity. And this helps to define the way he behaves. Okay, that's not much of a question, but I'll leave you to pick anything up that
yeah.
you
No, that's
can.
it. That's interesting. Yeah, you're quite. Yeah, you. Thank you for that, Douglas. Yeah, yeah, and you're quite right. The question of anti-clericalism is very clearly there in his views. So if you he was a clear believer that the Church of England should be disestablished. So this comes quite clear in his letters, but then also, I mean, you only need to pick up the Stark Monroe letters where um, he makes
Yeah.
very sort of stringent condemnations of basically most forms of organized religion and the clerical class and its role within society, and the different ways in which they impinge upon people's beliefs. There's a certain sort of libertarian streak. And I suppose he was always conscious about maintaining the divide very clearly between libertarianism and libertinism, because obviously it's a slippery slope. Because if you start off with personal liberty, libertinism can never be too far, can never be too far away. Um, so yeah, that's definitely true. So I mean, he would the Matrimonial Causes Act, and indeed the project, the much broader Victorian project by which the sort of the tangle of medieval canon law and common law was sort of rationalized is one of the causes that you can imagine him supporting wholeheartedly. In terms of his reputation, yeah, definitely. He's interesting though because he's in some ways also a champion for writers who don't do that themselves. So it seems to be the case that he was quite careful about managing his public image. He wanted it to be unstained, unspotted, and to be able to protect that. But he did also seem capable of advocating for writers who didn't. So I'm thinking here about his public advocacy in the case of George Moore's novel Esther Waters, which was not was it 1894 possibly 1891 possibly. But anyway, all of the sad Georges, Gissing, Moore, Meredith. He was a strong proponent. Emile Zola too. He
Brilliant
was
book
someone who
title.
argued that these writers who push the boundaries should get more of a hearing, and that people should, under the right circumstances, the right people should be able to access them. And was a critic of the sort of rather prudish environment of British publishing. So yeah,
Yeah,
he wanted that freedom for others that he wouldn't take up himself, I guess.
thank you. Great.
Bert, do you have a question?
Oh, yes. Jonathan, fabulous. I really appreciate your talk. A comment and a question. One of the indicators, perhaps, of the relationship between Mary Doyle and Brian Waller is that when Conan Doyle was 18, his mother gave birth to her last child and
Oh
named
yes,
it
yeah.
after.
Was she called Brian?
Yes, Brian Mary, which was quite a kerfuffle
Yeah. You have
getting
to go
that
to
on.
quite some lengths to name your daughter Brian, don't you?
Yeah, Brian Mary Julia Josephine Doyle, known as Dodo, which I suppose was an improvement.
Yeah.
But my question is, what about family dynamics and tragedy? And you can't make too much out of the Sherlock Holmes cases, of course, but it's rather unusual. Here you've got the Stoner sisters, one murdered by her stepfather. You've got Violet Hunter with another deranged stepfather who has a child imprisoned in the attic. You've got the Devil's Foot with the
Yeah.
disaster of the Tregennis families, and Leon Sterndale, who
Yeah.
is unable to marry. Can you talk a little bit about family dynamics and all of that and how it fits? And I'm also curious about what you think about duet, because duet has
Oh yeah.
always me to be, just sort of the negative opposite of all of this.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. And there in the stories, I guess I always think about it in terms of Sherlock Holmes's role with the imagined or projected reader of those stories. So the kinds of problems that are presented to Sherlock Holmes, they're usually, not always, but very frequently, the pattern seems to be that the problems are presented as problems of property, problems of inheritance, problems of possessions that have been mislaid. All of these things tend to do with a kind of distortions in the domestic space. And when you need to establish a domestic disturbance in relatively short order, the easiest way is always to have a tyrannical figure in the family home. And I mean, one story that you didn't mention, although the list, and I think particularly the Devil's Foot, is a perfect example of crimes that emerge because people are kept apart by insufficient access to divorce. The other would be, of course, the Abbey Grange, where forgive me, the character's name escapes me, but the murder is committed by the wife's future lover, but Sherlock Holmes, forgive me, when he's presented with the facts of the case, decides that he's going to be his own divorce court and sit in summary judgment of it. So yeah, I think that's very much there in the stories, and I think that's part of Sherlock Holmes's appeal, I suppose, which is as a private detective rather than representative of the state. He's capable of making judgments that the state, in all of its kind of legal complexity and slowness and unresponsiveness, judgments that it would be unable to make. He can be more flexible. He can be more. He can take on board evidence and not apply the same standards in different cases. And so he's a kind of like an idealized vision of English justice, embodied in a single man who can right these wrongs as they are presented to him. Oh, and you mentioned duet, yeah. So I think that's an interesting contrast. I think particularly if you read duet after the Stark Monroe letters, because of course in the Stark Monroe letters you get a version of Conan Doyle's courtship with his wife, and at the end of the story he says, "Oh well, now I'm jetting off to my future life, where I might be a magistrate, or I might be a justice of the peace, and my life will be rather dreary, but no doubt very satisfying. The life that Conan Doyle would have lived, no doubt, if he hadn't become a successful writer." And then there's a note at the end. It's like, and they died in a train crash, and it's almost as if Conan Doyle is sort of kissing goodbye to the life that he no longer had to leave or felt obliged to lead. And in Duet, you get a kind of, there's a freshness to it, and it's a much more sympathetic, I think, a much more ardent depiction of first love and marriage and its possibilities. And I don't think it's accidental that it was written and published after he'd met Jean. And I think it's Andrew Lycett who makes this argument that, perhaps it's Daniel Stashow, forgive me, but suggests that the story is a kind of his gift to Jean, in the sense of, here's the idealized courtship that I would have offered you had I not been already married. And I think that's quite a compelling lens to read that novel through, although the novel itself is well worth reading, well apart from those issues.
Thank you. John.
Thank you, Jonathan. Enjoyed it immensely. Getting back to Mary Doyle for a minute, I think another thing that added a lot of grist to the rumor mill was she spent the last part of her life living in a house on Brian Waller's estate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't think you'd mention that. Maybe you did.
No, I didn't. No, you're quite right. And again, because there's a comment from someone called Brian W. I hope isn't actually Brian Waller or descendant, because he's not coming out very well from this. Yeah, so Conan Doyle was struck throughout his life once he achieved success and independence, particularly with the Sherlock Holmes stories in 1891. There were several moments in his letters where he asks his mother to come and live with him, and I think in his own mind this was a natural consequence of that. Now he could provide the stability for his mother that his father had been unable to provide for her. And he seems to have been quite annoyed that she persisted on living on this cottage on Brian Waller's estate, and in fact chose to live there right up until the First World War, I believe, where she did eventually relocate. It's important that this was indeed after Brian Waller himself had married as well. So again, absence of evidence, not evidence of absence, but that does speak, I suppose, to the very strong relationship that Mary Doyle had with Waller, whatever its real contours may have been.
Jay, do you have a question?
Yes. First, I would like to say thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I really like your work. It took me a while to track down your copy of memoirs, but I did get it through my library.
Well done.
But it was fantastic, so thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm new to Sherlockian and Doylean scholarship, but like you, I think I'm stuck here.
No way out.
Yeah. So I had a question in regards to Doyle's general political career.
Yeah.
Just because I'm mostly confused about it. It's a bit of an interesting timeline because this happened after two failed attempts of two separate times trying to get into politics.
Yeah.
One in Edinburgh Central and one in Hawick boroughs. Sorry if I'm saying any of that wrong.
Oh no, don't worry. Actually, I can't remember the name of the borough, so that's helpful.
Yeah. So I mostly just want to know why was he trying to still be involved with such big social causes and not be involved in politics?
That's a good question. I suppose the truth, I mean, again, there's usually like a human truth underlying all of this. And the truth is that it's a lot easier to pontificate from your living room than it is to actually. And he did, obviously, in those attempts, he does seem quite keen to have gotten into Parliament. And he was quite active in his local Liberal Unionist party. So he met some of the key figures of that party. So for those people who are unaware, the Liberal Party in Britain was part of the two-party system with the Tories on one side and the Liberals on the other. But the Liberal Party split over the question of Ireland when William Gladstone became committed to passing Home Rule for Ireland, and there was a big strand of the Liberal Party that didn't want that to happen, and so essentially they formed a coalition with the Tories on the other side. And so Conan Doyle, being committed to Ireland remaining part of the Union, sided with that movement. And so both times he ran for Parliament, it was under that ticket. And he does seem to have really wanted it. He seems to have worked reasonably hard at it while he was there. But I think by that stage, he's so comfortable that I think there's a degree of satisfaction. I mean, I remember, I think it was Douglas who did this, where he did the enormous list of all of the clubs and societies and movements that he belonged to, and I think that appealed to him probably more than sitting in Parliament, which was a kind of prestige position that he felt like he should occupy, but maybe wasn't that sad when he lost. There was some anti-Catholic rhetoric directed at him actually in those campaigns. So it was suggested that he was going to. I can't remember exactly what the content of those were. Maybe someone else will be able to supplement them. But as I recall, he was slandered as a papist in some respects, which, if you know anything about Conan Doyle's life and attitudes towards religion, is fairly absurd.
Welcome aboard, Jay.
Thank you so much. I just went to London for the first time, and I did a short paper about Doyle and spiritualism and a little bit of speculation onto why I'm not seeing anything regarding Doyle just about anywhere, especially in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Yeah. So that was fun and interesting. And I have a little Holmes archival website. So I'm very excited to keep going with that.
Well, that's great. Welcome to the party.
Lovely. Bert, have you got another question at all? No. Okay. Any other questions?
Just the two things for Jay. Nice to hear from you, Jay. First of all, I have to tell you, and this will be a disappointment to you, the pronunciation of that Scottish name, Hawick, is Hoik. Hoik. You have to get used to these things if you're getting into this kind of scholarship. The question of Catholicism was interesting because he was supposed to be a sort of outsider candidate in Edinburgh, but his campaign was very successful. He himself, at least, believed that he was going to win. And then on the last day before the actual election, his opponent had leaflets printed basically saying that Conan Doyle was a Catholic. And that was enough in Calvinist Edinburgh to turn the tide and make him lose the seat. That was at least Conan Doyle's story of what happened. But as Jonathan says, I think he was probably actually quite relieved not to get into Parliament. He wouldn't have been very good there. And he had better ways of spending his time.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to look more into that and maybe find one of those pamphlets. But I know once he got into medical school, that changed a lot of his views quite significantly because he was very strictly raised. Sorry, I say this weird because of my professor, Jesuit.
Yeah,
Um,
Jesuit.
yeah. And then from there, it just downhill spiral into all sorts of other things. So that's been fun looking into spiritualism.
Yeah, well, Edinburgh Medical School was a machine for manufacturing atheists and free thinkers, just like it did for Robert Louis Stevenson before him. It was, yeah, they took it in with the water. They took it in with the turpentine in Edinburgh Medical School.
Brilliant. Lovely to meet you, Jay, as well. It's nice to see you at Worldwide Doyle. Um, anything else, anyone? Any other questions? I think that's it. We've got to thank you so much for a very interesting talk from Brian W. I can claim Brian as one of my lovely volunteers who does the blog. So that could be quite a coincidence, couldn't it? I think that's it. I think we're done. Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was really interesting. And as I said previously, something that I didn't really know very much about. So really interesting to find Conan Doyle has another cause up his sleeve, if you like, and also the reasons why behind it. It's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? So thank you. And thank you, everyone. This will go out on a recording with the Doings of Doyle YouTube site, and it will go on our website as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. The next one is the 3rd of July with Sheldon Goldfarb, and we're looking forward to that. So we will see you next week. Can't believe it's next week. And then that's the final one for this year already. It goes so fast. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to save everything here and we will speak to you all very soon. Thank you, Jonathan. I hope that was okay.
That was brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone, for the questions. Have a good evening, everyone.
Everyone seems to come off camera just before they go as well, which is quite funny. You suddenly see this audience that you've never seen, people you haven't seen before.
Well, thanks so much for setting it up anyway. I really appreciate it.
It was great. You had really good numbers. You're 20 people, which is a fair dues. Very good.
Brilliant. Well,
But
looking forward to the next one. I'll be along next week.
yeah,
And,
fantastic. Lovely. And if you're ever down south and you fancy coming to see the Conan Doyle collection, do let us know. More
will
than happy
do.
to host you.
It's been
Yeah.
12 years since I was there.
Yeah. It's yeah, we've really got a few more bits. We managed to acquire the George Doughty papers, which is very interesting. So there's yeah, very interesting stuff. But yeah, and we
I should
find
probably
stuff.
request a catalogue from you so I can go over it properly.
We have oh, this is where we all fall apart. So we have a Spiders
Sorry.
catalogue online. So I'll send you the link to that
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah.
in a moment. Yeah, it's sadly we could do with a really good digital version. That'd be amazing, wouldn't it? So that people would probably search. But I think that's the Holy Grail, isn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely. I know how difficult it is. Oh, well, I wish good luck with your projects as well and your groups.
Yeah. Thank you, and good luck with your books. I look forward to seeing them.
Indeed. Yeah, I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, take care. Bye.